Welcome, everyone, to our April Coffee Chat. I'm Laura Knudsen-Murray. I'm the GIS Coordinator and Community Outreach Assistant with IrisBG. With me today is Shanna Jones, who is our Social Media and Community Outreach Assistant. A note that our recordings and presentations and other material will be made available in our Knowledge Library. As with all of our other previous Coffee Chats, they can be found in the category Articles and Presentations. You can also follow the topic Coffee Chats and be notified via email anytime something new is published. Also, we have a forum that you can subscribe to and follow different topics. We're posting new articles there all the time. And as you like to bring up questions to each other, that's a good place to start a dialogue on us. And the idea behind these Coffee Chats is that we at IrisBG would like to offer you a space where you can connect with your peers and have a chat about IrisBG and some of the issues that may arise with the work of your collection. We don't have a fixed format for these sessions, so please get in touch with me if you'd like to present a challenge, talk on a topic, or if you'd like us to give a demonstration. It can be anything, big or small. Hopefully you'll make some new connections here today, and together we might become a little bit wiser. Here is an overview of everyone who registered for the Coffee Chat today. It's great to see all the different institutions that are joining us. We have our regular poll where you're able to rate your experience using IrisBG. Are you a novice, an intermediate, advanced user, or just trying out the trial? Looks like 71% of us are intermediate and 29% are advanced. Great. Thank you. Our agenda today, we have Kerry Dillon, who's the plant record specialist at Cornell Botanic Gardens. She's been there for 6 years, and she is going to share with us about building collaborations for biocultural collections. Without further ado, I will give the screen over to Kerry.
Thank you, Shanna and Laura, for inviting me to talk about this. My name is Kerry Dillon. Like you said, I've been the plant record specialist here at Cornell Botanic Gardens for about 3 years now. Before that, I was a gardener managing our deciduous shrub collection. And so I'm hoping today to just share a little bit about some of the collaborations and engagements that Cornell Botanic Gardens has been involved with over the last decade or so, and how the relationships with our Indigenous community were initiated and how they've developed over time. I'm also going to share a little bit about our mission and strategic goals and how those have helped guide our collaborations. I'm going to share a little bit about current project we're supporting through the linguistics department at Cornell University to preserve the Gayakono language, which is the native language of the Indigenous community where we are. I'll show some of the thought process through how we share that information, and then if there's time, I'm going to show some of the actionable steps we've taken to update our interpretation and records and collections policies. So first, I just want to acknowledge that Cornell Botanic Gardens, and as part of Cornell University, is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, or Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a history and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So I'll just share a brief intro of the garden itself. So we are located on the Cornell University campus in Ithaca, New York. Altogether, our public garden comprises over 3,800 acres. Primarily, our botanic gardens are the 20 acres to the northeast of campus, adjacent to the Ag and Life Sciences departments. We also have an arboretum making up about 100 acres, and then the rest is natural areas that we manage throughout the county. We've been here since 1925, initially started as an arboretum, eventually became Cornell Plantations, which, as you can imagine, is a kind of has a negative connotation, and we've made some changes since then. We have a staff of about 37, horticulture specifically about 15, between gardeners, our horticulture team, and our IPM team and seasonal workers. We get about 700,000 visitors annually, and as part of our mission on part of the university, we are free and open to the public year-round. So here's just an inset of the main Botanic Gardens area. This is where our Welcome Center is, and some of our primary display and interpretation gardens. So we have our herb garden, which holds around 500 annuals and perennials that have edible and medicinal value and histories. Winter garden display garden, rhododendron collection, and then our pounder vegetable garden, where this is where the majority of the collaborations we've done with the Haudenosaunee community have taken place. It is a demonstration garden where we've been showcasing sustainable techniques here for backyard food gardens. And there's also a climate change garden there as well. These are just some images of the areas around the Welcome Center. And then we also have our Arboretum. These are just some images of the ponds in the center, where this is more of a classroom space for recreation, for teaching, for researchers to come. And that's connected to the main garden area. And this is where most of our core collections are located. So we are accredited PCN Maple and Oaks collection through the multi-site groups. Our nut collection, crabapples, dogwoods, magnolias, and conifers are mostly located in the Arboretum, but we focus on both unique and historic cultivars, as well as wild collected specimens and plants of conservation value. So like I said, historically, we were named Cornell Plantations. 2015, 2016, we went through a rebranding process where the name was officially changed to Cornell Botanic Gardens. And we also changed our mission to really focus on nurturing and unique and personal connection people have to plants by celebrating the link between biological and cultural diversity. And so this mission is really driving what we do. So how we interpret plants, the research we support, and the collaborations we engage in is part of that has kind of sparked the more purposeful engagement we've had with the Haudenosaunee community. They also have strong goals to preserve plants and biodiversity as it relates to their culture. And so that's where we've kind of overlapped and aligned on some of the collaborations we've done. As putting together a strategic plan, we've kind of decided to focus on a couple things. So Grow, Inspire, Connect, we're going to focus on cultivating and conserving plants and cultures they sustain, nurture the unique and personal connection people have to plants, and also create alliances to collectively fight the loss of bioculture and diversity. So all of that really ties into where we're trying to go and how we're trying to connect with our Indigenous community. Just for a little background, this is a map of the Haudenosaunee territory, also known as the Six Nation Territory. The star there is where we are, the base of Cayuga Lake in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. So the Gayacono or Cayuga is the group that is specifically where we are. But over the course of our collaborations, we've worked with several different nations within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And Haudenosaunee itself translates to people of the Longhouse. And really that means a connection between the Six Nations and how they, strive to work together for the same goals. I also want to note that we're very fortunate to have an Indigenous community on the Cornell campus. We have the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, or ACE as we usually call it. They are focused on coursework, student engagement, and learning specifically about Indigenous communities. And then there is also a residential hall on campus specifically designated for North American Indigenous students to really connect, called Aguego. And we've done some work with them as well, which I'll share a little bit about. So our first really significant collaboration, when we first changed our mission, 2015, started with a desire for us to do a sort of a deeper programming focusing on white pines and their significance with the Indigenous communities. So white pines are native to our area. They're all over the place, but they're also very significant to the Haudenosaunee people. They refer to it as the tree of the great long leaves, or also the tree of peace. And so the symbolism for them is that the tree represents the peace and unity of the Six Nations. And it's very prominent in historical events leading to the creation of their Great Law of Peace. So it's a really important and significant tree for them. So we initially reached out to the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program on campus to get input on this and, see if they wanted to work with us on this and get input from them on some of the things that we should be doing. And the result of that was we had some exhibits and programming around this and their relationship to the tree, which culminated in a tree planting ceremony with Cayuga Chief to commemorate their culture and our connection here. So that was kind of the start of it. Because we were working with the ACE group and already had that kind of relationship, the director of the ACE program at the time, Jolene Rickard, the following year reached out to us with the idea for the Planting Moon Garden. So she's a visual artist as well, and she designed this installation that we hosted in our Pounder vegetable garden. And so this was, when we talk about collaborating, this was kind of, I would say, not hands-off, but hands-off, kind of giving her control over the design and what's going in it. And we were simply there to host and take care of the plants. And so kind of letting her and the ACE community drive the process. And so what that entailed is the installation of the Planting Moon Garden. That was both a garden and an artwork piece. So there was an earthwork installation of 13 mounds, which were meant to represent mounds in the form of a turtle's back, representing Earth's creation and the 13 moons in the annual lunar cycle. It also included interpretation and planting of the Three Sisters mound system, which we're pretty familiar with, of corn, squash, and beans, as well as tobacco and sunflowers. Also included in this display was interpretation in both English and Indigenous languages. So that was really helpful for them to be able to showcase that in our gardens. And then following that, she hosted what was called the Gathering. And this is not put on by us, but put on by them and hosted by us in our space. So this was a gathering of Haudenosaunee communities across New York State. So Cornell researchers, students at Cornell and Syracuse University, which is about an hour away from us, and farmers in their communities. And it was so they could get together and discuss and share Indigenous agricultural knowledge, traditions, and aesthetic practices. And also a big part of this was a seed distribution. So the seeds that were harvested from the Planting Moon Garden that year were distributed to the people attending the symposium so that they can be preserved within the Haudenosaunee community. And this, they're still doing this each year in some form. So that's continued since 2016. And then a couple of years later, again, this was somebody who reached out to us based on what they had heard about the Planting Moon Garden and the Gathering Symposium. Stephen Henhock is Gaikono, a historian and first language speaker. He instructs the Cayuga language course at Cornell, which started a couple of years ago. The main focus of that is language instruction and discussions about the Cayuga Nation, their culture, history, and future. But a key part of that was using space in our vegetable garden as a teaching site. So part of the curriculum was growing more of these heirloom plants and regenerating the seed populations, which is kind of similar to what was happening with the Planting Moon Garden, but it's now a permanent part of their curriculum. And then just briefly following up, you mentioned before the Indigenous Hall on campus, the Guego, they reached out to us about working with our Learning by Leading students, which is a program we've had for a couple of years now, kind of a transition from what used to be our internship program, where we have 2 student co-leads in each section who kind of guide other students and we're guiding them. And so this was more of a student-to-student collaboration where together they worked to figure out what plants they wanted to grow in this healing and honoring garden that they planted in front of the residence hall, and then worked together to grow the plants, plant them, and care for them. So that's just a rundown of some of the collaborations we've had over the past decade or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have been directly involved in over the past 2 years or so. So we worked quite a bit now with Stephen Henhock. So John Whitman, Stephen Henhock, Troy Richardson, all members of ACE or in the linguistics department at Cornell, applied and received a grant to help preserve endangered and Indigenous languages. And as part of that grant proposal, they included Cornell Botanic Gardens specifically as a small portion of that to essentially take the words that they're preserving, and Stephen is recording him speaking them for plants, specifically for us, with the intention of sharing those on Garden Explorer, and also kind of preserving them in the database on our end so we can share them in the future for signage interpretation and other programming. The other parts, greater parts of this project are building the BioCultural learning project, which Stephen is spearheading. And so the language and the words that they're sharing with us are also being shared through their own avenues. So it's not just us, but because of the plant connection, they wanted to include us on this so we could share it on our end. And so just briefly about the process of this, when we started working on it, coming up with what plants to find the words for and record, we provided a list of about 200 plants that exist in our wildflower garden and natural areas that they had separately been looking to add signage to, and also our theme bed in the herb garden, which is herbs used by Indigenous peoples. And I'll talk more about that a little later. And so between me and a grad student that they hired, went through this list and kind of checked through the names that they could find words for. And then Stephen and John checked those to kind of make sure they're correct. They were using a Cayuga English Cayuga dictionary, and also supporting it with a Seneca English dictionary. And so out of the 200, we probably got about, I think we're up to about 40 now. So it is a real challenge to come up with those names specifically. So Stephen, as obviously a first language speaker, believe there's about 6 to 8 native speakers left of the Gaikono language. And of those, not everybody is a plantsman. And so it is a real challenge to preserve those words from going extinct when you don't necessarily have a person who has all the details. So obviously it's a language that is at threat of being extinct. So that's kind of the goal of it. And I will say through the process, we were just talking about this, some of the challenges that we came across between the words that we provided them and the words that came back. There were a lot of non-native plants, which for me was kind of a learning experience because I expected them to be plants that were native to our area. But in fact, several of the plants that are used medicinally and culturally are plants that were brought here by the English and the colonizers. So that was interesting to learn. Another challenge was some of the plants that are being recorded and that we do have words for are what we would consider weeds. They're plants that we don't accession. So burdock, cattail, they all have uses. And so while we're preserving the information in the database, they're not necessarily things that we can share on Garden Explorer at this point. There may be opportunities in the future to share through the tours feature where we can add more details about that and not necessarily connected to an accession plant. But for now, that's kind of what we're working with. There are also several plants where we were given a common name that is common to several species. So like Eutrochium, Eupatorium, there are 3 native ones here, excluding boneset. And so where we're at right now, we're still waiting for feedback on how to proceed with those. Do we try to narrow it down to one? Do all 3 of them get used for the same purpose? Do we just use the genus on the signage? And so there are ways to work around that, but trying to share that in Garden Explorer for those plants is a little tricky, but we do want to collate them with as many of the plants that we actually have accessible in the collection so that we can share this through Garden Explorer. Another challenge that we had was, we don't want to use a literal translation. So they're using a dictionary, but the literal translation isn't necessarily the correct Gaekono name for it. Another challenge was some of the common names don't necessarily match up with the common names we have, which makes sense. So cedar was a good example. So we have the word for cedar, we have a sound recording for cedar, but cedar is not native. Well, it's not endemic to our area, but we do have eastern red cedar, northern white cedar, we have juniper or arborvitae. And so part of, having people working on it who aren't plant people, and then people who don't know the language but are plant people, there's a little bit of investigating to kind of narrow down and sort these out. So the translation they have for the word cedar is flat pine, which to me makes me think it's arborvitae. And so we haven't confirmed that, but I'm going to assume that what it is, but we are still waiting for feedback on that. Another one that was a challenge was soft maple. So we weren't able to narrow it down. Soft maple, swamp maple, red maple. But initially we got the word soft maple. So it was, what exactly is this maple we're referring to? Or is it several different species? So that was a interesting process to figure out. And so obviously a lot of you are intermediate or advanced users. So this is probably all stuff you know how to navigate, but I just wanted to share the thought process on where we're deciding to share the language information that we have. And so there's currently 3 different places I'm sharing it so that we can capture all of it on Garden Explorer. So one, obviously in the taxa common name, we've added Gaekono as a language. We're including the common name there. Some of the plants that we got came with a lot of linguistic data, whether it's a association of how the word is broken down in its meanings. So example, the Staphylia, breaking down the Gaekono word, translates to it rattles or her rattle. But in some cases, they also shared the grammatical information. So this zoic, neuter, singular, agent, noun, prefix, that's something that is being shared in the Cayuga language class. And so we're still trying to navigate how much of that do we share on Garden Explorer. For now, we're just saving it as a reference in the database and not necessarily sharing that on Garden Explorer. But in situations like this where the words actually break down and translate, I think is important to share. And so like I said, at this point, we were hoping to have it live, but as much of a priority as this is, other parts of the grant are higher priority. And so we don't want to publish anything that we haven't had consent or confirmed the formatting on. So it's really just sharing what we are capable of doing, and then letting them decide what looks best to how they'd like to share it. So that's one place where we're storing the information. The second place is I've created Gaekono plant names theme. So these can be filtered out on Garden Explorer. If there is information, I'm including it there, so it'll show up on the taxa profile. Oh, the one thing I forgot to mention about this as a formatting. So we haven't confirmed this, but just as a kind of seems intuitive, we're ranking the Gaekono word first, so that when it comes up in Garden Explorer, the Gaekono word is the first word that comes up in the list of common names. And I do think that's important. So the sound recordings we're receiving, we're sharing that under the references tab in the files. And as it's just an MP3 file, one of the formatting things I'm waiting to hear back on is how exactly the text above the sound recording shows up on Garden Explorer. So what I did, I put together a couple examples of what we could share in the description field, so that kind of relates to how it shows up on the taxa page. I realize there's probably a better way to do it on the tourist page, but we're not quite at that level yet. So, and then something that didn't even occur to me until I put together this presentation is we could also add a web link to the Gaekono language project right on the taxa profile. So that is another thing that we're considering doing. But again, checking back with our partners to make sure that makes sense and that that's appropriate. So just on the front end of Garden Explorer, you can see we've got a theme set up for it, so it's easily filtered, and we are using those BioCultural names as the first common name in the list of common names that we have. Now, here's where they're showing up, each of those 3 categories on the back end. The common name, any description under the theme, and then the sound recording down here. So that's really cool, and that's how it looks. And we do have the sound recordings, but before we go ahead and publish everything, we do want to clear up some of those formatting concerns before we put everything up. So this is just an example. It is live. So that's kind of the gist of the project that we're working on in Garden Explorer. How that translates to some other topics in how we adapt and change our plant records, our interpretation, our collections policy. So we're doing on time. Just want to share briefly some of the things that we or have done recently, like within the past 2-3 years. And these are based on the communication, the relationships, and what we've learned from the partners that we have been working on. We're really relying on them for input and consent and just like final approval on how things look in our interpretation. So I just wanted to share briefly so we have our herb garden. That's one of the main gardens right by the Welcome Center. So there's 17 theme beds total in the herb garden. We have always had, and you can see the interpretation signs here. It's a wooden label for each bed that shares a little bit about the theme. Each plant in each of the beds has its own 3x5 metal display label that includes the information like the use or purpose of the plant. So this is the portion that is the herbs used by Indigenous peoples. It's about 100 square foot bed space, and we have currently about 25 different taxa in there. This is just a plant list. You can see the labels. So this is specifically plants cultivated and collected by Indigenous peoples of North America for medicinal, nutritional, and ceremonial purposes. It's not necessarily specific to the Gayakono or the Haudenosaunee, so it goes beyond that. So we want to make sure that we're representing everybody who's included in these plants. So 2022, up until then, this was actually called Herbs of Native Americans. And based on our conversations, we reached out to the ACE community to get feedback on what would be a better name for this theme bed. Our first suggestion was Herbs of Indigenous People. Their feedback on that was it should be herbs used by Indigenous peoples, plural, and that both Indigenous and peoples should be capitalized. So we renamed the bed. So each theme bed has interpretive sign for the bed specifically. We updated that to include the new name and also included the land acknowledgement right on the interpretive label. And then going through the existing plant labels that were there, anything that had a word that might be problematic or incorrect. So if it included American Indian, Iroquois, words that are not appropriate or approved by this community. So we replaced those labels with the appropriate terms. Then another important step is that any of these interpretive labels that included a reference to Indigenous people in the past tense were updated to reflect present tense because they are still here. So that was a very important step to take in our interpretation. So that's a little bit of the changes we've done so far. This is something that just came up recently. So we've kind of addressed the interpretation that we have, but there are also plants that we have that, other than being accessioned, we don't have extra interpretation, or they may not have a particularly significant biocultural value or importance for interpretation. And so we haven't sat down to address this yet and go through and see like what all the problematic common names we might have in our collections. But just earlier this year, our director of natural areas reached out to us and brought this up. You know, should we be having this conversation either on our curatorial team conversations or our biocultural goals team conversations? And he shared this article specifically on this one species, Sorghastrum nutans, which most common name, Indian grass or yellow Indian grass. This article does a great job of explaining, why it should be changed, and also importantly, a suggestion on how to change it. So we followed the guidance in the article, but part of I just want to thank the plant records community and the plant nomenclature and taxonomy communities for putting together the document on problematic common names, because when this came up, the ask was, let's have a conversation about this. What are we doing about it? And I could say, oh, well, actually, we already have guidance on this. And that was extremely helpful. So we haven't really gone through everything in there, but in a situation like this, we can kind of address it on a case-by-case basis. So what I did was just quickly search for any common names that include the term Indian, and just to kind of share how it's pretty easy to search that and narrow it down, but I can share kind of the process of what happened. So we found 12 taxa and 1 genus that had a common name, including Indian. Of those 7 taxa, the common name was not the primary or, most common name. So those were easy to just remove. 4 of those taxa referred to their Southeast Asian distribution, so we didn't really change anything about that. Obviously, we changed the sorghastrum common name. In the process, there was a genus common name in the database for sorghastrum as Indian grass. So I just removed that. We don't really use genus common names. We'll use family common names on our signage, but we don't really need that. So I just removed it completely. And then you have the outliers. So this last one, Lobelia inflata, the most common name is Indian tobacco. And it's the term that was given to us back on the plants that had been recorded. And so obviously this is something where we need to have a greater discussion, because we don't want to use this term as a common name if it's offensive. However, it is the most common name. And so we don't want to just remove it without having something to replace it with. There are other common names, not great ones. So I think I was trying to look this up. Gagwort, vomitwort, bladderpod. So I do want to see what it should be before we go change it, because those aren't attractive common names either. So that is just one of the things that's come up in the process of changing common names for us. So I just wanted to share that. And lastly, just some things that we've changed or updated in our collections policy, specifically as it relates to collaborating with our partners. We've added land acknowledgement to our collections policy. That's the first thing in the document. We've included local Indigenous communities as a partner in seeking periodic review and input on collections development. So we want to make sure that they're included in the processes going forward. I didn't really get into it, but we are in our second round of doing a deep dive into a specific cultural connection to plants. Our next one is going to be specifically working with plants significant to Indigenous communities. And then really the goal of that being, in the long term, the plants that we do this deep dive on to focus on their cultural collections, what of those plants, in the process of growing them year to year, what do we want to keep in our permanent collections? So our last 3-year exhibit was really helpful in determining, what should stay in the collections permanently. And so we're hoping to do that going forward and just kind of identify what should stay in the collections and what is, extremely important and valuable. So that's everything I have to share today. There are some links here. The Haudenosaunee, the Gaikona Learning Project, and a couple videos from projects that we've done in the past. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Kerry. This was fantastic. you.